Shalom, shalom, everyone, and welcome back to part 2 of our presentation of the acceptable year, a chronological timeline of the Messiah walking the Zadokite calendar. And you can go to our website and print out the timeline chart and the written document to follow along, and I'll put that link in below here. This was an extensive 2-year study on what really felt like an intimate walk with our Messiah, as if we were actually walking with him and his people. We were seeking proof, one way or the other, of our high Melchizedek priest, observing the priestly calendar as we understood it from Scripture, the books of Enoch and Jubilees, and confirmed in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Or was he, as many claim, walking the calendar the same as the Pharisees and the Sadducees? So we just had to know for ourselves. And an interesting note, well, I find it interesting anyway, is that in the book of Enoch, after Enoch is given the calendar and all the information about worldly events, he is given exactly 1 year to teach his son and all the people what he had learned. And we read about that in Enoch chapter 81, verse 6. We shall let you stay with your son for 1 year, so that you may teach your children another law, and write it down for them, and give all of them a warning. Enoch certainly had a warning for them. And in the 2nd year, you shall be taken away from among all of them. We had already discovered and mostly understood the calendar found within Enoch's teachings before we learned of and studied the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we were already kind of putting into practice the Enochian calendar when we were introduced to the Dead Sea Scrolls. And once we saw what the scrolls said and did some study, we did have to make some small adjustments to our understanding of the Enochian calendar. For example, the biggest change we had to make was at first, when we were first learning the Enochian calendar, we accounted the vernal equinox as being day 1 of the week, that it all started there, not day 4. But the mathematical evidence in the scrolls overwhelmingly points to the vernal equinox to being day 4 of the week, which is tied to the 4th day of creation and the sun sign given by the greater luminary mentioned in Genesis 1:16 through 18. 3 days later, our Creator rested and blessed the 7th day as a Sabbath day of rest. The instructions found within the book of Enoch is the framework in order for us to never lose the original Sabbath day. So no matter how many calendars come and go, and how much the earth changes on its axis, adding to the year, we were given this framework so that we will never lose the 7th day of creation. So we will always know the true Sabbath day. And perhaps that is the reason the book of Enoch was taken out of the canon by the rabbis, who were now in control of the temple. They did not want the true solar calendar revealed, keeping followers in the dark and attached to their lunar reckonings. In part 1 of this series, we determined that the Messiah was 35 years old. And if you missed part 1, please go back and review that, thus making 32 AD his acceptable year, which he proclaimed on the first Sabbath of his public ministry. Now, this was the 7th priestly Sabbath of the year, and 7 sevens, as we spoke about before, means to seven oneself, and that means to take an oath. So when we seven ourselves, we're taking an oath. That also means to feed to the full. And remember, the Messiah is fulfilling the Torah throughout this walk in events and locations, which will be a witness to his timeline. And remember, on this trip that he took over to Nazareth, part of the reason he went, or the main reason he went, he declared that he was going to go out and proclaim what his mission was. And that, he said, was to heal the sick, give sight to the blind, hope to the downhearted, and to proclaim the acceptable year of his Father. And that is what got him in trouble over and over again in the synagogues. And we read that in the scripture where it said he untied their Sabbaths. He didn't do their Sabbaths. He messed up their Sabbaths. And it didn't follow the Sabbath at all. In one verse, that's what is proclaimed. The Pharisees say, oh, that Yahshua, he doesn't even follow the Sabbath. And we see that over and over again for the reason they want to kill him. And then it'll say, and he also thought he was equivalent to Yahshua. But they always say because of the Sabbath first, and then because he thought he was the Messiah. Not that because he thought he was the Messiah first, that was the secondary reason. The first reason was because he was taking away their Sabbaths from them. He was untying their authority. He was making it null and void. I also believe that this seventh Sabbath, where Yahshua proclaims the acceptable year, is a clue to us that it was a sabbatical year. 7 sevens is a sabbatical. That's the sabbatical year. And the Jubilee year being the year he died. So 32 AD being the sabbatical year, and 33 AD being the Jubilee year. And if we count sabbaticals the same way we're told to count 7 sevens of the Omer for the 3 feasts of the Shavuot season, which would be barley to wheat, a 50 count, and then on the 50th day is day 1 of the next 50 count to wheat, from wheat to wine, and then another 50 count from wine to oil. So the 50th day is always the first day of the next 7 count. So if we count our sabbatical years the way that we're shown in the Bible, on counting the Omers, then the next Jubilee year would be 2042. And this would be the 41st Jubilee since the Messiah's death. Will this be the Jubilee he returns, taking us out of the wilderness that we've wandered since his death? Remember, he was in the wilderness for 40 days. Has the ecclesia then been in the wilderness for 40 Jubilees? I guess we'll soon see. Or perhaps the Messiah will return in 2041, the last sabbatical of the cycle, just as with his acceptable year. Something to ponder. On the day after John proclaims the Messiah to the Jews, we see the Messiah returning. This is the 10th day of the 2nd month, where John calls Yahshua the Lamb of Eloah, on the very day the lambs would be selected for the 2nd Passover. On the priestly calendar. On our timeline, the Jewish Sabbath in 32 AD, the Julian Saturday, falls on day 4 of our priestly calendar. Now this is important to remember as we continue through the Messiah's 1-year ministry of miracles and him upsetting the Jews with untying their Sabbaths. We saw how the wedding at Canaan on the 3rd day of the week also coincided with the priestly calendar that the Messiah followed. where he met up with his mother and performed the miracle of the wine before his time has come, which he tells us in John 2:4. He scolds his mother for coming to him and asking him to do this favor for her. And he tells her, my time hasn't come yet, woman. And I believe he was saying this because that his hour had been saved for the second Passover. When the Ruach had brought the sick to be healed that night after the sun had gone down at Peter's house, as our Messiah is the second Passover, our second chance. Month 2, day 15. On the 15th day of the second month, Yahshua had left Capernaum, stopping first, like we said, in Nazareth on the 7th Shabbat of the year to proclaim the acceptable year, where the Pharisees wanted to throw him off the cliff because he had just taken the authority of their Sabbaths away from them. From there, the Messiah traveled among the villages throughout Galilee, working his way back towards Capernaum, spreading his news and the reason for his mission. Now, we aren't given many clues as to the day-to-day happenings of this road trip. And I think mainly that is because he wasn't accompanied full-time by the few men that he had already called, as they were also working men, some with families, and still had their worldly jobs to attend to. As we see when the Messiah approaches Lake Gennesaret, we see Peter working the boats and performed the miracle of the fish. You know, when he overloads the boats with all the fish in Luke 5:1-11. And it happened that the crowd was pressing on him to hear the word of Eloah, and he was standing by Lake Gennesaret. Now, Lake Gennesaret is another word for the Sea of Galilee, but it gives us a clue as to the location of this event. Just 3 miles away, Gennesaret is one of the neighboring villages of Capernaum. It is often argued that this is also where Legion was delivered into the herd of pigs. We will be discussing that a little further in this study. But for the meantime, the Messiah was up north, spreading the word about his mission. We believe that during this travel time, the Messiah also gave the Sermon on the Mount and healed a leper. Now, this healing of the leper is an anchor point of the 3 synoptic gospels. Later, we will see that we have clues to the timing of his return to Capernaum. So then we can extrapolate the amount of time the Messiah was away and the events that would have happened during that period. So he's going through for a few days and teaching and proclaiming the reason he came. So from the 15th day to the 23rd day of the second month, Yahshua is out on this little road trip. And now we get down to the 24th day of the second month. So we're told that after some days, the Messiah returns to Capernaum. Now in 32 AD, there were 10 days between the priestly second Passover and the Jewish second Passover. And the Messiah took that time to travel through the villages of Galilee, spreading his good news. With the second Passover coming near, the Messiah returns to Capernaum. How do the scriptures confirm this is the second Passover for the Jews? Mark gives us the answer, so let's follow along. Mark 2, verses 1-7. And again he entered into Capernaum after some days, and it was heard that he was in a house. And at once many were gathered, so none any longer had room, not even to the door. And he spoke the word to them. And they came to him carrying a paralytic, being borne by 4, And not being able to draw near to him due to the crowd, they unroofed the roof where he was, and digging through, they lowered the cot on which the paralytic was laying. And seeing their faith, Yahshua said to the paralytic, "Child, your sins are forgiven to you." Now, of course, this upset the Pharisees. Mark 2:6. But some of the scribes were sitting there and reasoning in their hearts. Verse 7. Why does this one speak blasphemies in this way? Who is able to forgive sins except the one Eloah? So after this, Yahshua moves on and makes his way down to the waterfront, where he calls Matthew along the way. Mark 2, starting with verse 13. And he went out by the sea again, and all the crowd came with him, and he taught them. And passing on, he saw Levi, which is Matthew, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax office. And he said to him, "Follow me." And rising up, he followed him. And it happened, as he reclined in his house, even many tax collectors and sinners reclined with Yahshua and the disciples, for there were many, and they followed him. Verse 16, and the scribes and the Pharisees, seeing him eating with the tax collectors and sinners, they said to his disciples, "Why is it that he eats and drinks with the tax collectors and sinners?" And hearing, Yahshua said to them, "Those who are strong have no need of a physician, but those badly having illness. I did not come to call the righteous to repentance, but sinners." Okay, so now the key to the timing of the second Passover. Mark 2:18. John's disciples and those of the Pharisees were fasting. And they came and said to him, "Why do John's disciples and those of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" Now, if we're following along the timeline and looking for a fast around this part of the spring, what we find is that there is a fast observed from sunrise to sunset on the eve of the Passover. In Hebrew, it is called Ta'anit Bekarat, or Ta'anit Bekarim, the fast of the firstborn. This fast would have been observed for the second Passover as well. The custom of the fast of the firstborn is still observed today, nearly universally throughout Orthodox and conservative Jewish communities. Luke 5:34, but he said to them, "You are not able to make the sons of the bride chamber fast while the bridegroom is with them. But the days will come, even when the bridegroom is taken away from them. Then in those days they will fast." Now, of course, he's referring to the Passover where he will die on the stake. Day 25, month 2, the Jewish second Passover. The Jewish Holy Convocation Day for the second Passover is where we find the Messiah and his group plucking grain from the field. Continuing with Mark 2, verse 23. And it happened, he went along through the grain fields in the Sabbaths, and his disciples began to make way, plucking the heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, "Behold, why do they do that which is not lawful on the Sabbaths?" So again, we have Sabbaths as a plural. Remember, it typically means the second Sabbath of the week, a feast day Sabbath. And Luke confirms this for us. Luke 6:1. And it happened on the second chief Sabbath. So the second Sabbath of the week, the second chief Sabbath. He passed along through the sown fields, and his disciples plucked the heads and were eating, rubbing with hands. Now this is a special Sabbath, also called a high Sabbath. Unlike the weekly Sabbath, which started at sundown on the Roman Friday and ended Saturday at sundown, this special Sabbath can fall on any day of the week because it was set by the moon. We can clearly see by their words that this is one of the Jewish holy days, and they are once again upset at the Messiah's actions. And just to prove their Sabbaths wrong, he enters into the synagogue as they gather for their second Passover convocation and causes a disruption. Mark 3, starting with verse 1. And he entered into the synagogue, and there was a man who had a withering of the hand, and they watched him, whether he will heal on the Sabbaths, that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had a withering of the hand, Rise up into the middle. And he said to them, Is it allowed on the Sabbaths to do good or to do evil, to preserve life or to kill? And they kept silent. Now, why would he ask them this? We would think in our minds, well, of course the Messiah can do good on the Sabbath. I mean, after all, there is first the donkey in the well clause, and secondly, he is the Messiah, right? But the Messiah isn't asking, can he? He is asking if it is allowed. The Messiah is calling them out, and they know it, and are not happy about it. Now, many of you would argue that the Messiah was simply coming up over the Pharisees for their Talmudic practices. But we see further down the timeline in John, once again, where the Messiah is healing on a Jewish Sabbath. And he tells them, we're going to go to John 5:16, and this does happen further down the timeline in the study. But we're going to talk about it right now because, again, the Messiah is making a point here. And it's contrary to what we're taught in the church. In churches, we're taught that what the Messiah is saying is he's just coming up over the Pharisees' practices, their own traditions. Where we see in John 5:16 and 17, where the Messiah is once again healing on the Jewish Sabbath. And this was quite a public healing, and it will be part of this section of the study. But anyway, so the Messiah is healing, and they're coming up against him again, and he says to them, My Father works until now, and I work. It's John 5:17. The Jews, John 5:16 says, the Jews persecuted Yahshua and lusted to kill him because he did these things on the Sabbath. That's the major reason they wanted to kill him, was because he kept untying their Sabbaths. And that's a big deal. And he says to them, My Father works until now, and I work. Yahshua is making a proclamation that he works on the days his father Yahuwah allows, not of the days dictated by the Pharisees. And so he said to them, Would I be allowed to do this if it was the Sabbath? The Messiah made it clear in John 5:17 that he works on the days that his Father himself worked, and that this day was in fact a work day and not one of his Father's rest day Sabbaths. His Father rested on the Sabbath and would expect his Son to do the same. Therefore, since his Father worked on this day, so shall he. So Yahshua was in the synagogue in Capernaum on the Jewish second Passover, telling them it is in fact not a Sabbath day. To prove it, he healed a man with a withered hand and then asked them, if it were really the Sabbath, would I be allowed to do this? Mark 3, starting with verse 5. And having looked around on them with anger, Being greatly grieved over the hardness of their heart, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched out, and his hand was restored, sound as the other. And going out, the Pharisees at once took counsel with the Herodians against him, and how they might destroy him. He keeps messing up their Sabbaths, and they wanted to kill him for it. They were untying their Sabbaths. He was taking and removing their mark of their Sabbaths. Luke 6:11, and they were filled with madness. I'm seeing a lot of madness right now on the internet over this. And they were filled with madness and talked to one another as to what they might do to Yahshua. So that evening, after the Jewish second Passover, the Messiah receives a visitor. John 3:1. But there was a man from the Pharisees, Nicodemus his name, a ruler of the Jews. And this one came to Yahshua by night and said to him, "Rabbi, we know that you have come as a teacher from Eloah, for no one is able to do these miraculous signs which you do, except Eloah be with him." Now Nicodemus was a man of quite some stature among the Jews. Being from Capernaum, which we see in John 7:50 through 52, Nicodemus most certainly would have been in the synagogue on the Jewish second Passover, having witnessed for himself the incident of Yahshua healing the man with the withered hand. Nicodemus had to come to see the Messiah for himself. After Nicodemus takes his leave, the Messiah goes out to be alone and pray. Luke 6:12. And it happened in these days, he went into the mountain to pray, and he was spending the night in prayer to Eloah. Day 26, month 2, the apostles are called. Starting with Luke 6:13. And when it became day, he called his disciples, also choosing out 12 from them, whom he named apostles. Simon, who he also named Peter, and his brother Andrew, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon, the one being called Zealot, Judas, brother of James, and Judas Iscariot, who also became the betrayer. And he went up into the mountain, and he called near whom he desired, and they went to him. And he made disciples of 12, that they might be with him, and that he might send them to proclaim, and to have authority to heal diseases and cast out demons. So Messiah has called together the 12 on the mountainside. Then continuing with Mark 3:20. And again a crowd came together, so as they were not able to even eat bread. So he calls his men together, and they can't even celebrate. They can't even break bread together in this new covenant agreement they have. These apostles have just made with the Messiah, because the crowds are seeking him. So less than 2 miles away from the town of Capernaum was the slope of the Mount of Beatitudes, also known as Mount Aramus, a Greek word meaning solitary or uninhabited. This area would have provided ample space for a large crowd to gather to hear the Messiah. The flat area where the Messiah chose was a natural amphitheater, thus allowing his voice to carry over the multitude that had gathered to see him. And this is where the Messiah delivers the Beatitude sermon in Luke 6:2 through 49. Then continuing with Luke 7, verse 1. And when he had completed all his words in the ears of the people, he went into Capernaum, which was about 2 miles away. And a certain slave of a centurion, one dear to him, having illness, was about to expire. And having heard about Yahshua, he sent elders of the Jews to ask him, asking him that he might come to restore his slave. So the centurion, who was a friend of the Jews, sent the Jewish elders, which I think is kind of funny, to ask him that he might restore the centurion's slave. And coming to the Messiah, they earnestly beg him, saying, "He to whom you give this is worthy." This is probably the centurion who had helped them build their synagogue there in Capernaum. And Yahshua went with them, but he being not yet far away from the house, the centurion sent friends to him, saying to him, "Master, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy that you would come under my roof. And for this reason I did not count myself worthy to come to you. But say in a word, and let my servant be cured. For I also am a man, having been set under authority, having soldiers under myself. And I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it." And hearing these things, Yahshua marveled at him, and turning to the crowd following him, he said, "I say to you, I did not find such faith in Israel." His own people did not have this faith. He's not talking about the country of Israel. He's talking about the house of Israel, his people. We see that Yahshua only marveled on a few occasions. He does so here at the faith of the centurion, and also at the unbelief of his own people in Mark 6:6. Now note, at this point in Luke's gospel, we find the Messiah at a place called Nain. Now this would have been impossible for the Messiah and a large group of people to travel the distance in one day. This event, we believe, plays out later in the Messiah's story. Remember, does it make sense, and is it probable? Continuing with Luke 7. Luke 7:36. And a certain one of the Pharisees asked him that he eat with him. And going into the Pharisee's house, he reclined. After the Messiah healed the centurion's slave, one of the Pharisees desired that he would eat with him. Luke 7:37. And behold, a woman who was a sinner in the city, knowing that he reclined in the Pharisee's house, taking an alabaster vial of ointment. Now, it was pretty bold for this woman, with a sinful reputation, to come into the house of a Pharisee. But she was willing to do anything to express her love for Yahshua. Luke 7:38. And standing at his feet, weeping behind him, she began to wash his feet with tears. And she was wiping with the hairs of her head, and she ardently kissed his feet, and was anointing them with the ointment. We can imagine that originally the woman was coming only to anoint the Messiah's feet with the oil. But then, being overcome with emotion, tears flowing from her eyes, she washed his feet with those tears, wiping them clean with her hair, and kissing his feet repeatedly with love and affection. Day 27, month 2. Calming the sea. After an eventful evening at the Pharisee's house, we find the Messiah spending the next day teaching at the water's edge. We can imagine the breeze coming off the lake as the sun warms the pleasant spring day, people gathering there at the upper part of the Sea of Galilee near Capernaum to listen to this teacher of the word, hoping to be healed by his hand. We start out with Mark 4, verse 1. And again he began to teach by the sea, and a large crowd was gathered to him, so that he entered into the boat in order to sit in the sea. And all the crowd were on the land toward the sea. And he taught them many things in parables. And with many such parables he spoke the word to them, even as they were able to hear. But he did not speak to them without a parable, and he explained all things to his disciples privately. The Ruach would guide those who would have an ear to understand the words that the Messiah spoke. His message was for them. It was the Ruach's job to bring the knowledge to the masses. That is why the Messiah explained privately to his disciples. Mark 4:35. And evening having come, he said to them on that day, let us pass over to the other side. And dismissing the crowd, they took him along in the boat as he was. And other small boats also were with him. And a great windstorm occurred, and the waves beat into the boat so that it was filled already. And he was on the stern, sleeping on the headrest. And they awakened him and said to him, Teacher, does it not matter to you that we are perishing? After teaching all day, I would imagine that the Messiah was ready for some sleep. Taking his leave, he heads to the back of the boat, trusting his men to be in charge of the voyage. Now, it's not unusual for a storm to pop up on the Sea of Galilee in the springtime. But this one had even the most experienced fishermen worried. Mark 4:39. And being awakened, he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Silence, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was great calm. And he said to them, Why are you so fearful? How do you not have faith? So he scolds them after all you've already have seen. How do you not have faith? And they feared a great fear and said to one another, Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? They still hadn't gotten it. Now we find an agreement with our timeline with the Philip Schaff's popular commentary on the New Testament, Mark 4:35 through 5:31. And I quote from the commentary. The time of the voyage across the lake is fixed by the account before us. It was the evening of the day, so on Mark 4:35, when the discourse in parables had been uttered. The other account, Matthew 8:18 and Luke 8:22, can readily be harmonized on this view. The conversation with some who would follow him, Matthew 8:19-22, seems to have taken place just before he crossed the sea. Also, as I was plotting out the Messiah's day around the anchor points, I thought this day seemed familiar to me. Interestingly, a couple thousand years earlier, Noah was dealing with torrent waters as well. Genesis 8:14-16. And in the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry. And Elohim spoke to Noah, saying, Go out of the ark, you and your wife, and your sons' wives with you. Noah had to rely on his faith in Elohim to see him and his family through the torrential storm. In contrast, we see the Messiah scolding his men for not having any faith as he calms the waters. Day 28, month 2. The pigs. Early the next morning, they arrive in the region of Decapolis, near the towns of Gergesene. We can assume that it is morning as the farmers are out feeding their livestock. In this case, it was pigs, you see in Mark 5:14. Starting with Mark 5:1, and they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of Gadarenes. And Luke also confirmed that they did sail across from Galilee. And Matthew 8:28 also says, and he, coming to the other side into the region of Gergesene, 2 demon-possessed ones met him, coming out of the tombs, very violent, so that no one was able to pass through that way. Now the country of Gergesenes, or Gergesa or Gadara, were towns near each other. Hence, the country between them took its name sometimes from one and sometimes from the other. Some argue that this took place in the neighboring town of Capernaum, named Gennesaret, because of a later healing the Messiah does in Mark 6:53. Here, though, we are given information by Mark 5:20, that the man healed was told to spread the news throughout Decapolis. It would be odd to tell him to take a trip across the lake into another country to spread the news, if it had happened over near Capernaum. Now, instead of sailing all the way back to Capernaum, the Messiah's group docked in Kinneret. Mark 5:21. And Yahshua, having crossed over in the boat again to the other side, a large crowd gathered upon him, and he was by the sea. And behold, one of the synagogue rulers named Jairus came. It is mostly thought that this happened in Capernaum, but that does not make any sense. If the Messiah and his men were already at the south end of the Sea of Galilee, why would they sail all the way back to Capernaum, then walk right back to that area as they head to Judea, which comes next in the timeline? Situated on the southern end of the Sea of Galilee, Kinneret is mentioned in both the Old and New Testaments. Older Bible translations spelt the name alternatively as Kinnereth with a K, Kinnereth, or Kinnereth with a CH, and sometimes the plural as Kinneroth. In the Hebrew Bible, the Sea of Galilee is also called Yam Kinneret, or Lake Kinneret. When the Jews were expelled from Jerusalem by the Romans, many fled to the area around Kinneret. This population included a large number of the great rabbis of the time, who wrote the Jerusalem Talmud while sitting along the shores of the Kinneret. Jairus, meaning enlightener, most likely was there along the water's edge with his fellow associates, perhaps praying and lamenting over his sick child. Then they saw the Messiah's boat approach. Having heard the stories, Jairus ran towards the Messiah, falling at his feet. His only thought is that the Messiah could save his child. Mark 5:22. And seeing him, he fell at his feet. And he begged him very much, saying, My daughter is at the last end. I pray that you will come and lay hands on her, that she may be cured and live. Mark 5:41. And taking hold of the child's hand, he said to her, Talitha cumi, which is, being translated, Little girl, I say to you, rise up. Immediately the little girl rose up and walked, for she was 12 years old, and they were amazed with great amazement. For she was 12 years old. Now, there's an interesting note here. As the Messiah was trying to make his way to Jairus' house, a crowd was pressing upon him. When in the midst of the crowd, a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years came up behind Yahshua and touched the hem of his robe, saying to herself, If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Mark 5:28. And her flow of blood dried up immediately. Yahshua felt that power had gone out from him, and he turned to ask who had touched his clothing. And his disciples looked around and they're like, this is a huge crowd. How do we know who touched you? I mean, people were everywhere. But the woman came to him, trembling in fear, and falling down before him, told him the truth. We see that in verse 33. Yahshua said to her, Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. Note also that Jairus' daughter was 12 years old as well. When a Jewish girl turns 12 years of age, they are recognized through a bat mitzvah, as full-fledged adult women. And this is about the time when a girl will start her menstrual period. So then, what is the significance of the blood flow and the coming of age? If the woman had been bleeding for 12 years, this means that the bleeding would have started around the time of the girl's birth. Then the woman was healed from the bleeding when the girl came of age. Is it a coincidence that Leviticus 12 is all about the uncleanness of the blood flow? Leviticus 12:6. And when her days of cleansing are filled for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring a lamb, a son of a year, for a burnt offering, and a young dove or a turtle dove for a sin offering to the door of the tabernacle of the congregation to the priests. And other than Leviticus 12's instructions on a woman's blood cleansing being fulfilled and offering up a lamb of a year old, pointing to the 1-year ministry of Yahshua, and perhaps the young girl represented the young dove. This blood connection is the shadow of things to come. The following year, on this very date, is the 40th day of the Messiah's resurrection. It is Ascension Day. Hebrews 10:1. For the Torah had a shadow of the coming good things, not the image itself of those things, appearing year by year with the same sacrifices which they offer continually. They never are able to perfect the ones drawing near. From the blood of Abel's slain lamb in Genesis to the robes of the saints washed in the blood of the Lamb in Revelation, the word of Eloah centers around the blood sacrifice of the Messiah. Hebrews 9:22 tells us that without the shedding of blood there is no remission. The Messiah's death was just as important as his blood sacrifice, and equally important the burial and resurrection. But everything concerning the events of Yahshua's life were leading up to the blood being applied to the mercy seat before his Father in heaven. Hebrews 9:24. For the Messiah did not enter into the Holy of Holies made by hands, types of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of Eloah on our behalf. The Messiah took his shed blood to heaven to present unto the Father by applying it to the mercy seat. This is why he said to Mary in John 20:17, Touch me not, for I am not yet ascended to my Father. For the blood could not be tainted. On this day, 1 year in the future, the Messiah's blood would be applied to the altar before his Father, the blood that would cleanse our sins. When Yahshua gets to Jairus' house, with the healing of the woman's blood issue on his heels, the one who had been touched now touches the next generation. The touch of the former was a touch of healing. The touch of the latter was a touch of resurrection. The woman was healed from her blood issue when the girl came of age. This event points to the Messiah's coming of age through the death, resurrection, and cleansing with his blood at his ascension into the Holy of Holies. Also, after the Messiah's resurrection, he appears 12 different times, with the 12th being at his ascension. Note also that the number 12 is considered a perfect number that symbolizes Elohah's power and authority, as well as serving as a perfect governmental foundation. It can also symbolize completeness, or the nation of Israel as a whole. The following day, the Messiah once again heads to his old hometown of Nazareth. Day 29, month 2. Travel to Nazareth. Mark 6:1. And he went out from there and came to his fatherland, and his disciples followed him. Nazareth being about 18 miles from the coast, a good day's journey, arriving early evening of day 6 of the week. Day 30, month 2, Sabbath in Nazareth. This is the 9th Sabbath of the year. Once again, if we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls 4Q320 and 4Q321, we find a 6-year priestly temple schedule that follows 1 Chronicles 24. According to this information, and that found also in the Sabbath Song Scroll, this day is the priestly Sabbath. And once again, Yahshua was rejected in his hometown of Nazareth on the Sabbath. Let me say something right here. We see throughout the timeline, not too many things happen on the true priestly Sabbath. A lot of stuff happens on the Jewish Sabbaths, but not so much on the true priestly Sabbath. So when they do, we really need to pay attention. Mark 6:2. And a Sabbath having come, he began to teach in the synagogue, and hearing many were amazed, saying, From where came these things to this one? And what is the wisdom given to him, that even such works of power come through his hands? Is this one not the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? And they were offended in him. They were offended in him because he was teaching contrary to their ways. I mean, who is this? I mean, isn't he just the carpenter's son? I kind of get that from my own family. Who is she to know? Isn't she the one that did ... Anyway, I think many of us can relate to that who tries to follow the way. Our families think we're just crazy. Mark 6:5. And he could do no work of power there, except he performed healing on a few infirm ones, laying on his hands. And he marveled, again marveling at their unbelief. Matthew 13:57. And they were offended in him. But the Messiah said to them, A prophet is not without honor, except in his own fatherland and in his own house. And he did not do many works of power because of their unbelief. This brings us to the end of the 2nd month of the Messiah's public ministry. Thus far, we've been able to track the Messiah's walk from his baptism through to the 2nd Passover, where we found the Messiah coming up over the Pharisees for their calendar and their practices. To Nazareth, where the Messiah infuriated the men of the synagogue by proclaiming the acceptable year, and into Capernaum, where he taught them about the true Sabbaths with authority, healing and teaching throughout Galilee. We will continue to follow the Messiah's trek, where we see over and over again how the Messiah was walking in his Father's priestly calendar and not the traditional Jewish Sabbaths and feasts, fulfilling the prophetic words of his Father along the way. Now it's a new month and Messiah is heading in a new direction. Yahshua sets his sights on Judea. Day 1, month 3, the Rosh Chodesh. After spending the Sabbath in Nazareth, the Messiah heads towards Judea and ends up in a town called Nain. Remember that the Nain event was out of place and improbable earlier in the timeline. Luke 7, starting with verse 11. And it happened on the next day, he went to the city called Nain, and as he drew near to the gate of the city, even behold, one having died as being born, an only son born to his mother, and she was a widow. And a considerable crowd of the city was with her. And seeing her, the Messiah felt pity over her and said to her, "Stop weeping." And coming up, he touched the coffin, and those carrying it stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the dead one sat up and began to speak. And he gave him to his mother. And fear took hold of all, and they glorified Eloah, saying, "A great prophet has risen up among us, and Eloah has visited his people." First, I would like to say that nothing in the Bible is placed there accidentally. Out of all the towns where the Messiah healed and taught, why is this one little nothing town even mentioned? Nain is nestled between the plains of Megiddo and Mount Tabor. Looking out on the plain of Jezreel, the valley of Jezreel is also called the Valley of Megiddo, and some believe it to be the scene of the Battle of Armageddon. According to the passage in Revelation, it says that they assembled to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. Revelation 16 through 21. The word Armageddon is a combination of the word Har, meaning mountain or mountain range, and Megiddo. So Harmageddon signifies mountains of Megiddo. Now, Megiddo is defined in the Strong's Concordance as a rendezvous to assemble by troops, gather selves together in troops, cut self, or the place of troops. From the Jamieson Fawcett Brown Bible Commentary, we read that Megiddo comes from gadad, meaning to cut off, that is, to slaughter. Bible scholars continue to argue over the interpretation of this place called Armageddon. Most current scholars have come to one of two conclusions, as detailed in the Anchor Bible Dictionary. And it reads, one of the most popular indemnations of Megiddo was proposed by Hammel, 1890. He suggested that the Greek gamma in Megiddo is a transliteration, not of the Hebrew gimel, but of the Hebrew ayin. Thus, Harmageddon would be a corruption of the Hebrew Har Moed, or mountain of assembly. Torrey, in 1938, argues that Armageddon is a reference to Isaiah 14:13, where the mountain of assembly is the heavenly court on which Eloh's throne is located. Current scholarship generally settles on a link with Megiddo, or Har Moed, as the best explanation of Harmageddon. So there you have it. Most Bible scholars now believe that this place is a gathering of kings to the mountain of Moed, the mountain of appointed times. This is the same mountain of Moed on which Hallel, also known as Ha-Satan, declares that he will sit upon. The gathering of the kings to battle against Eloah takes place at the mountain of appointed times. And our Messiah is walking the acceptable year of his Father through the valley of Har Moed. When the Messiah approached the city of Nain, he discovered a great crowd coming towards him. But the crowd wasn't coming to see him. It was a funeral procession making its way to the burial grounds outside the city. Luke records that Yahshua had compassion on the mother, and a few short minutes later, the boy is raised and returned to her. Given that there were only 3 risings from the dead in the whole of the Hebrew Tanakh, it can hardly be a coincidence as well as that this miracle of Yahshua happened near where Elisha's similar miracle happened 800 years earlier, as found in 2 Kings 4. And as with Elisha earlier, the boy who had died was the only one of his mother, happening on the head of the 3rd month, the perfection of the number 3 once again. Day 2, month 3, travel. Here is where John picks up the story. The Messiah travels 30 miles to Aenon, where his cousin John the Immerser was baptizing right before he gets arrested. This would have taken about 2 days' travel. John 3:22. After these things, Yahshua and his disciples came into the land of Judea, and he continued there with them and baptized. Day 3, month 3, travel. After traveling some portion of the day, the Messiah arrives where John is baptizing. John 3:23. And John was also baptizing in Aenon, near Salem, for many waters were there, and they came and were being baptized. For John had not yet been thrown in prison. Day 6, the 3rd month, purification. Here we have a biblical anchor. Yahshua arrives in Jerusalem with John and his men. John 3:25. Then a question from John's disciples arose with the Jews about purification. Now, historically, this is the 3rd day of the 3 days of purification that Yahweh instructed for the Hebrews after arriving at Mount Sinai. Exodus 19:1. And in the 3rd month of the going out of the sons of Israel from the land of Egypt, on this day they came to the wilderness of Sinai. Exodus 19:10. And Yahweh said to Moses, go out to the people and sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes. And be ready for the 3rd day, for on the 3rd day Yahweh will go down before the eyes of all the people on Mount Sinai. The Israelites left Egypt on the 15th day of the 1st month. This was the 4th day of the week. They arrived in the wilderness of Sinai 7 weeks later on the 4th day of the 3rd month. This is also the 4th day of the week. The 4th day would have been day 1 of the purification, ending on day 6. How do we know that the Hebrews arrived on the 4th day of the 3rd month? The Book of Jasher, which has nothing to do with the tribe of Jasher, also called the Book of the Upright or the Upright Record, is full of early historic information. Chapter 62 tells the story of the Hebrews arriving at Mount Sinai. Jasher 62:6. And in the 3rd month, from the children of Israel's departure from Egypt, on the 6th day thereof, and Yahweh gave to Israel the 10 commandments on Mount Sinai. So we can see that it was the 6th day of the 3rd month when Yahweh orally gave the covenant to Moses. The people were supposed to purify themselves for 3 days, with the 3rd day being the day they met with Yahweh. Therefore, the 1st day of purification would have been the 4th day of the 3rd month. Now, is it a coincidence that this one kind of odd scripture about purification fits the Messiah's timeline? And if the Messiah was walking a different priestly timeline than the Jews, then why would the Jews be talking about purification? Because it happens that in 3 days it will be the Jewish Shavuot in the year 32 AD. Again, only Yahuwah could have set this perfect timing, where the Jewish Shavuot worked out perfectly with the questioning of purification. On the 3rd day, the Israelites would have purified themselves many years earlier. Now, the Israelites in decades earlier would have been taught the true priestly calendar. But years later, these things were changed because of the reckoning of the moon. But this timeline for the Messiah, it worked out perfectly, where it encompassed both the priestly timeline and the Jewish. Baruch Hashem. In Jewish tradition, the 3 days prior to Shavuot are called the 3 days of Hagbala, meaning restriction. Based on Exodus 19:12, where it says, "You shall set bounds for your people." These are days of sanctification and preparation for receiving the Torah. John 3, starting with verse 26. And they came to John and said to him, "Teacher, the one who was with you beyond the Jordan, to whom you have witnessed, behold, this one baptizes, and all are coming to him." And John answered and said, "A man is able to receive nothing unless it is given to him from heaven. You yourselves witness to me that I said, I am not the Christ, but the one having been sent. I am going before that one. The one having the bride is the bridegroom. But the friend of the bridegroom, standing and hearing him, rejoices with joy because of the bridegroom's voice. Then this my joy has been fulfilled." Shavuot represents the betrothal of the bride to the bridegroom. Day 7, month 3, the 10th priestly Sabbath of the year. Confirmed again via the Dead Sea Scrolls, we see that today is a priestly Sabbath. The Messiah would have arrived in Jerusalem, and we find him resting as his Father would have rested. Day 8, month 3, the Jewish Shavuot, 32 AD. John 5:1. And after these things, there was a feast of the Jews, and Yahshua went up to Jerusalem. There were only 3 feasts in which the Jews were required to go to the temple: Pesach, which is Passover; Shavuot, which is Feast of Weeks; and Sukkot, or Tabernacles. Yahshua, having been with John along the river Jordan, where his men were baptizing, would have taken this opportunity to be where the action is, in order to get the good news out to all the lost sheep. And isn't it interesting that it is at the sheep gate where his next Jewish infraction occurs? John 5:2. And at Jerusalem is a pool at the sheep gate, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches. Verse 5. But a certain man was there, being in infirmity 38 years. Seeing him lying, and knowing that he had already spent much time, Yahshua said to him, "Do you desire to become well?" Verse 8. Yahshua said to him, "Rise up, take up your cot, and walk." And instantly the man became well, and took up his cot and walked. And it was a Sabbath that day. Then the Jews said to one having been healed, "It is a Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to lift up your cot." John had already told us that it was the Jewish feast day Sabbath in John 5:1. Continue with verse 11. And he answered them, "The one making me well, that one said to me, lift up your cot and walk." Now, of course, they're coming up over him because of their Talmud practices of not lifting a burden on the Sabbath, and they take that literally. But I would like to draw attention to this one point that Yahshua makes here. It's more than just their traditions that he is coming up over. John 5:14. And after these things, Yahshua found him at the temple and said to him, "Behold, you have become well. Sin no more, that a worse thing not happen to you." And the man went away and told the Jews that Yahshua is the one making him well. And because of this, the Jews persecuted Yahshua and lusted to kill him, because he did these things on a Sabbath. And Yahshua answered them, "My Father works until now, and I work." Yahshua is making a proclamation that he works on the days his Father Yahuwah allows, not on the days dictated by the Pharisees. The Messiah made it clear to them that he works on the days that his Father himself worked, and that this day was in fact a work day, and not one of his Father's rest day Sabbaths. Therefore, since his Father worked on this day, so shall he. Shavuot is one of the pilgrim feast days, where all adult males are to travel to and gather at the temple. No service work is to be done on that day, as per Yahshua's own instructions. Would the Messiah go against his Father's instructions? No, never, because that would be a sin. And then his blood would be useless to us, because a sinful Messiah could cleanse nothing. John 5:18. On account of this, then, more the Jews sought to kill him. For not only he untied the Sabbath, he also called Eloah his own father, making himself equal to Eloah. Now, we talked about this untying of the Sabbath in part 1 of this study. But let's review, because it is an important point being made. And the Jews sought to kill him because, 1, he untied the Sabbath, and 2, he said he was the son of Eloah. Remember also that the Greek word for untied is loo, and that the Messiah threw the Pharisee Sabbath in the toilet. Remember the loo, the toilet? So let's review the Thayer's definition for untied. It means dissolve anything bound, tied, or compacted together, dismiss, break up, annul, subvert, do away with. He was doing away with their Sabbaths. He was depriving them of authority and declaring them unlawful. To loose what is compacted or built together, to break up, to demolish. He was demolishing, destroying, and dissolving, to overthrow, and to do away with. The Strong's Concordance tells us to compare G4468. So to compare the word untied to this word, it means to break, wreck, or crack. That is especially to sunder, a shattering to minute fragments, burst, rend, or tear. The Messiah destroyed, dissolved. He sundered the Jewish Shabbat. Sunder in the Merriam-Webster dictionary means to break apart in two, separate by, or as if by violence, or by intervening time or space. And they wanted to kill him for it. The scriptures declare that Yahshua is the fulfillment of the Torah. The Torah commands that the Sabbath be kept, a time that pointed the people to Eloah as they rested from their daily labors. Yahshua would have observed the Sabbath in the same manner, for if Yahshua had broken the Sabbath, then he would not be a spotless lamb. His sacrifice would not be accepted as payment for sin. No one could benefit from a sinful Messiah. And we will see throughout the Messiah's timeline that very few things happened, like I said earlier, on the priestly Sabbath. And when they did, they were significant. For example, so far, there are only 2 times we've seen anything happen on the priestly Sabbath. Both were his trips to Nazareth. The first visit being on the 7th Sabbath of the year, when the Messiah proclaimed the acceptable year in his hometown. And again 2 Sabbaths later, when he is again being rejected by his own people, which is a shadow of things to come. This happened on the 9th Sabbath of the year. Finishing up with John 5 and the Messiah telling the leaders at the temple that today was not a feast day rest of his fathers. John 5:19. Then Yahshua answered them and said, Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son is not able to do anything from himself, except what he sees the Father doing. For whatever that one does, these things also the Son does likewise. He's telling them, I work on the days that the Father worked, and I rest on the days my Father rested. And this indeed was a work day of my Father and not one of his rest day Sabbaths. Baruch Hashem. And this is where we're going to end part 2 of the acceptable year and the Messiah walking the Zadokite priestly calendar. I hope thus far that you have been encouraged to seek further knowledge in learning this exact calendar that is being restored in this end time to this end time generation. We're excited to continue in part 3, where we will see the Messiah celebrating the priestly Shavuot at a very important place in history. So until we meet again, I'm going to wish you shalom, shalom.
Shalom, shalom.